heck is that? Oh, hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the weekly Wringer series here on clanofthegraywolf.com. You've actually caught me right in the middle of doing some fall cleaning. Now, I know many of you probably do some spring cleaning, and maybe you never thought about fall cleaning, but it's the transition of the seasons, and I've never found that to be a bad time to start thinking about new beginnings, clean things up a little bit. Why not, right? Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that before the video is over. But I just wanted to say we've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Got to wrap up the desktop conversation from last week, which I think opened up a lot of different ideas. I've certainly got my own thoughts on that, which I'll share with you as I always do. And then I've got a question that I think is very much off the beaten path from how I have, maybe let's say from the questions I've asked thus far. But I think you're really going to enjoy this one. So let's start off with new folks. I like to kind of keep things going with that. The only new person I think we saw this week was Unibattles, which is welcome. Thanks, great to see you as part of the community. Hope to see you again. Smaller number of comments, but definitely quality number of comments. Had a lot of great thoughts come in about the question from last week surrounding the desktop. And as you recall, the question I asked you was, are we really witnessing the death of the desktop? That is, are we watching it kind of fade away at this particular point in time, with all of the different the transitions into all the different operating systems that have become so prevalent now in smartphones and different devices connecting to our TV and the internet that we see every single day, including, but not limited to, Windows 8, which appears to have a very kind of streamlined, less is more, kind of push button, almost Xbox Live feel to its desktop infrastructure. Interesting decisions to say the least. But what I asked you about was specifically, are we witnessing the death of the desktop? Now, I think sentiment was pretty evenly divided, although I would say that many of you really feel like the desktop is going to hold on. And I'm a little surprised by that. But I think when we dig a little bit deeper, we'll definitely kind of get to the granular items as to what exactly is going to keep it around or make it go away, which is exactly why I asked this question to begin with. So let's get right to the contributions from the community this week. I wanted to talk about DXT 180. And the contribution that was presented here was along the lines of the desktop computer, or let's say the desktop interface, is really related to the desktop computer. And the desktop computer has been, let's just face it, declining like crazy in terms of sales of desktop computers. Now, people are still, folks like you and me who probably still build their machines, things have probably been just about as steady as they've ever been for the desktop. But for retailers and for vendors that actually produce desktops, let's face it, desktop sales are in the dumps. There are so many different mobile devices that handle so many of the functions that desktops handle now, especially for the average user, and more to come for that in a little bit, is really they can handle those things in those desktop functions on a much smaller platform now. And so I think I see that point of DXT 180. As the desktop computer goes away, the interface that we're also familiar with the desktop goes away with it. And let's face it, it makes a lot of sense. Think about the first time you tried to use a laptop and you were using a desktop interface, right? When you go into a desktop and you have something like a touchpad or that little red rubber nipple thing that IBM and Lenovo's had, right? Whatever the case might be, as you're trying to control those things, it really doesn't have the same kind of usability as it does when you have an external mouse. I think we realize in that small, limiting view of the desktop, I think we see how limited it really can be for even a smaller platform. Now, we continue to modify the desktop to be able to be used by all those different pointing devices, so on and so forth, and I think it's done very well. But the point is, I think that's a glimpse into what we're seeing right now in terms of user interfaces being, I guess, replacing what we would think of as the standard desktop infrastructure. And also, I thought it was worth noting, DXT180 said, not a fan of changing to the Xbox Live kind of interface for all of what we would traditionally use the desktop interface for, right? And I think there's a lot to that. I was looking for that kind of opinion throughout, and I think we got a lot of good answers on it. But I think it was worth noting, first person to really say, you know what, I'm not really sure I like the idea of using something like an Xbox, less is more, kind of simplified interface to utilize all the functionality of my PC or device beyond that altogether. Mr. K had a couple of points I thought should be made. One is that the HUD and the desktop are somehow equal, or at least, I guess, progeny of one another, or at least the concept of the desktop originates with the HUD. Secondly, that Star Trek even uses a version of the desktop in the interfaces that they use on the shows. I have a bone to pick with both of these. One is that a HUD is not a desktop, that's first and foremost. I don't think Mr. K was saying that, but those two interfaces are very, very different and distinct. A HUD is there to be an accessory toward being able to look at something from real life. So it becomes kind of a supplement to reality, right? Where we see something and the HUD helps us identify, okay, without having to break my central focused vision and answer to my periphery, I can see that I have X amount of armaments available, or I am at a particular altitude, or I have a particular pitch on the aircraft at the time. That's a HUD kind of display. A desktop is never meant to do that. A desktop is designed simply for the fact that if you're going to be dealing with files, which is primarily what PCs deal with, or computers, let's say, then how do people organize files? They organize files inside file folders, and the way that they manipulate them is on the top of their desk. And they have a trash can over here where they throw stuff they don't want anymore, and they have a particular viewing area where they look at those particular files. And then once they're done, they might put them away and throw them into a filing cabinet, which keeps them otherwise. Hence, you see the birth of the desktop. It really is born out of the 50s and 60s use of the actual top of the desk as being the user interface of choice. So it is very distinct. We can see how that has been slowly maybe evaporated away or changed or evolved over the years, and I think it has. But the desktop itself is not a HUD and is very, very different than a HUD. Secondly, about the Star Trek point. Here's something I really wanted to think about, and this is why I think this is really cool. This is a great question to ask. In Star Trek, you have the complete opposite of a desktop. No one uses a desktop in Star Trek. Think of the LCARS operating system, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure if you can really even call it an operating system. But in any case, it's an interface by which all the people on the Enterprise deal with the central computer, which functions to control all the computational abilities of the Enterprise, right? So the way that you interface in is with an interface that does have buttons that have specific functions, but it also seems to be the ultimate in customization, where we can move things around, where almost we can actually program LCARS to do whatever kind of functions we could possibly imagine in the meantime, right? So if we want to sit down at a particular station and have 5 buttons that do 5 different things, we customize it to do that. And then if we want to move a certain function, like say a slider bar in the transporter room, we want to move that to a different place. LCARS looks very fluid in that regard and able to really answer those particular mechanics very easily. If I want that on my right hand versus if I log in and come down as a left-handed user, maybe I want it on my left hand. The point is, folks, LCARS really shows, I think, the future of controlling computers, interfacing with devices without using a desktop at all, unless we forget as well that most of the interface that's done with the computer or the Enterprise is done by voice and vocal command. That's also something we've seen evolve really by leaps and bounds over the last 5 years. Shira Wolf brought a tremendous contribution this week because he really pointed to smartphones really still utilize a desktop infrastructure. Now, I will not lie to you. One of the reasons I actually asked this question was because smartphones have deviated so much from a desktop infrastructure that they make us kind of look at it and go, wow, why would I want this desktop to do what I want to do? But I have to say, you are absolutely 100% right. And the more I thought about that, the more it really bothered me. If I pull out my Android phone and I just, type in my passcode right now, it comes up with basically a desktop infrastructure. It's got icons that I can move around to different parts of my desktop. It's got places where I can drag and drop things to delete them. It's got a status bar that shows me certain indicators as to what kind of things are going on for my computer at that particular point, what might be using the processor. It also shows me that status bar. I can pull it down, I can control certain specific settings and those kinds of things. In other words, it looks exactly like a kind of modified version of Windows or Mac OS or Linux, the like, right? So I really started to think about that, and I realized that the apps themselves are what are kind of ripping us, away from the idea of the desktop proper, and not the actual interface and operating system of smartphones as being the desktop infrastructure. Very, very good point. Certainly made me rethink how I see this particular point in time. So with smartphones really being kind of an offshoot of the home computer, we still definitely see the desktop infrastructure surviving for today. And I think it's not difficult and it's not erroneous to say that we could easily see smartphones utilizing a desktop kind of infrastructure for years and years and years to come. Seems to be exactly where we are. Estolia brought up the idea, which I really, really liked, about pro users and everyday users. Maybe a different nomenclature that I would use, but let's stick with it, right? So we have everyday users that are most people that buy PCs, or most people that use PCs, or most people that use your phones, or the devices you hook to your television. Let's face it, folks, the people that are being targeted for consumer electronics. The everyday user, right? The everyday user really doesn't seem to have much of a use for the desktop. You could even make an argument that one of the reasons that the computer became popular with everyday users, but also one of the reasons it was very limited with everyday users, was because of the desktop interface in and of itself. So I think people the everyday users like the less is more. Think of the Wii for a moment, right? Where things just kind of pop up with channels, and those channels have bright flashing lights and video, and you just go, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to go play this game. Well, there it is right there. I just click that little thing, and it pops up, and the game's loaded, right? It's very limited. It's very less is more. There's no kind of opening a CD, examining the file structure, seeing what kind of things are kept inside. You just go, I want to play that game, and I want to play it now. Bang, done, right? Not the way that the desktop, it is the way that the desktop eventually became or began to be used, but it's certainly not the way that the desktop was designed. But more interestingly, pro users, people that really do, like I say, build their own desktops or have very specific kinds of functions, utilize a very powerful software that has a lot of probably its own intricate or user interfaces, like say Photoshop and the like. Those things are almost always locked into people that utilize the desktop, and there's a reason why. Pro users want to get deep down inside that file structure. They want to have that ultimate capability to dig down deep into what's going on. They don't just want that less is more. They don't just want to kind of go, all right, I want music, and then the machine scans everything and shows you a list of the music you have. I personally, because I guess I'm more of a pro user in this sense, hate that. It's one of the reasons I can't stand iTunes. I want to be able to go in and actually see the file, click the file, and or go say, you know what, I want these files included here. It's very, very simple. I know it's archaic. I know it's probably old school. Some of you mentioned that, but I think the idea of pro users and a niche holding on to the desktop is not outrageous at all. And in that sense, it's here to stay. Those sentiments were echoed by the Llama that talked about the idea that there will always be a kind of place for a desktop infrastructure, especially for those of us that grew up with it, especially for those of us that are very familiar with it and almost don't know how to interface without it. So it really is, I think, an argument to make that the desktop will always have a place there. But I think what that really points to is the fact that the desktop